Hi, in the third part of this series of videos, I'm going to be talking about constructors. In the second video about getters and setters, you saw that when I create a rectangle, I'm setting its width and its height to these values. Now, if I have to assign a value to each variable separately, then it becomes a bit of a hassle, especially for classes that have a lot of instance variables. So what I would like to be able to do is, at the time of construction itself, when I create the object, I would like to create an object by saying rectangle R is a new rectangle with the values 2.4 and minus 3.1. With some understanding of the order in which these values have to be passed, we'll call that. Now you'll notice that this part of the code that I've highlighted is just like any other method. It's got a name that happens to be the same as the class name, and it has two parameters. This is a special kind of a method in a class that has the same name as the class and no return type, not even void. In this case, I want two parameters, and the understanding is that the first value is meant for width and the second value is meant for height. So if I add a Java doc, W is the value intended for instance variable width, and H is the value intended for instance variable height. Now, one way of doing that would be I can assign these values directly. I can say width becomes W and height becomes H. And when I save this, you can see that the compilation error is gone. If I run the program, something horrible happens, which is height becomes minus 3.1. So the problem is that the constructor can be called from the client because it's public, and it's assigning a value directly to width and height. So in my class, I had instance variables, I had a setter, and I have the constructor. I've made my instance variables private so the client cannot access them. So that's your client. So what the client is supposed to do is call the setters, and the setters will assign a value to instance variables. But now what I've done is I'm calling the constructor, and without validating, the constructor is assigning value to the instance variable. So I've created a backdoor for the client to exploit. So, and that is not good. So the moral of the story is that constructors, or for that matter, anyone, any piece of code that wants to assign a value to instance variables must go through setters. So I call the method set width, and the value I provide is W. The method set height, and the value I provide is H. When I run the client now, I've gotten rid of this backdoor that the constructor also has to call the setter, and then the setter assigns a value in a validated manner to the instance variable, which is good practice. So when I run this, the height is initialized to 0.0. One more thing you'll notice when you create a constructor is if you create a second rectangle without any parameters, it doesn't work anymore. Earlier it was working and now it doesn't work, and the reason being, if you define constructor with parameters, which is known as parameterized constructor, then Java takes the default constructor, default means no parameters, away from you. So you have to redefine it. One thing you can do is you can leave it empty. If you leave it empty, each variable will be initialized to its default value. So let's comment this part of the code out. So we are only talking about object S. And you can see width height become 0 for object S. Or if you want, you can assign values of your choice to the instance variables. Now when the default constructor is called, this is the constructor, and will assign 1 to width and height. Similarly, I can create a rectangle of size 2.8. But what's the meaning of 2.8 or one value? So we can create a third constructor which has only one parameter. We'll call it double S. Now, if there is only one parameter, is it meant for width or is it meant for height? Or is it meant for both of them? So this is a constructor to create a special kind of a rectangle, which is a square. Here, width and height are both assigned the value S. Now when you run this piece of code where an object S is constructed with 2.8 each, you can see width and height are both 2.8. And that's about constructors. Thank you for watching. In the next video, I'm going to talk about compare to method.